right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for participating in this evening's webinar. This webinar is titled Making Sense of Research Studies and Registries. And today's guest speakers are Karmen Trzupek and Ryan Colburn. Karmen is the Senior Director of Scientific Programs at Global Genes. In this role, she's responsible for developing collaborative programs and partnerships that maximize the power of patient-owned data to advance rare disease understanding and support the development of treatments. By background and training, Karmen is a clinical genetic counselor who has dedicated her career to supporting patients and families impacted by rare diseases, and to partnering with rare disease communities as critical stakeholders in the advancement of clinical and therapeutic research. This work has spanned academic care, clinical research, telemedicine, and nonprofit advocacy. Ryan Colburn has some genetic variants, just like everyone else. In 2015, he learned that some of his variants are associated with a rare metabolic disorder and has unapologetically altered course ever since. His professional background is in development, engineering, and operations management as applied to race cars, airplanes, rockets, satellites, and rare disease. He's a driven student of process and, in this context, applying what he's learned along the way to contribute to the health of the rare disease ecosystem. He's passionate about empowerment and engagement and shifting the view of patients as subjects to one of participants, collaborators, and partners who can help to find the most effective ways to accelerate progress on understanding and solving challenges in rare disease. Throughout the presentation, you can send questions at any time by clicking the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and Karmen and Ryan will answer the questions at the end of their talk. Thank you for joining us, Karmen and Ryan, and with that, I will turn it over to you. Ryan, you're muted.
I clicked the unmute button. Good now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. And screen looks good?
Looks great.
All right, cool. Thanks for everybody for coming out. You can set your expectations low for the first part of the talk while I'll be covering a few things and teeing it up for Karmen to bring us home with actually important stuff. So first, I guess we'll jump into the overview and key concepts. Want to talk about a little bit of like research studies and patient registries and how those are each critical tools in capturing patient experience, which improves our disease understanding, management, and treatment options. A little bit about different types of research studies and patient registries that exist in Pompe disease, how these different tools contribute to our understanding of the disease itself, and then also the development and application of interventions. Some stuff about data, how it's shared, how it's used, and then considerations of what to think about as you're choosing whether to participate in a research study yourself or not, or a registry. So first thing is maybe to cover a few of the critical elements of a research study or a registry. There's things like study architecture. So this looks at what is the defined population? Is it disease specific or not disease specific? What are some of the research questions? What are the critical domains? And domain is just fancy medical speak for the area of the body or the function that we're looking at. So governance, what is the oversight and decision-making criteria? How is that data protected and used appropriately? And how is that appropriate use enforced through the structure of the study? And then what are the partnership agreements and contracts look like? Who has rights to the data? What rights do you have as a participant, et cetera? Data security. So this is a little bit related to some of the governance stuff, the oversight and decision-making, but it's really talking about institutional review board, sort of a nonpartisan board reviewing the data to make sure that it does meet a certain ethical standard. What compliance might look like. So there's different jurisdictions. So for example, GDPR covers a lot of how individuals' data works in Europe. We have PHI and HIPAA. We have HIPAA covering PHI, protected health information, in the U.S. And then also consent. Who you're sharing with, how they're using it, what access they have, et cetera. Then there's something about the design. So how is the design of the study supporting the drive for innovation in the space? So there's different standards of how the data can be collected. And as a sort of a funny example, but also true, and if you know me, it's maybe kind of annoying. My first crack at like how do I do registries was an Excel sheet, and I asked my friends with Pompe like, hey, how do you feel on this? What are your numbers on that? And collecting that. It's really great. I can get some kind of information out of that, and I can develop some kind of insight of that. But if I wanted to use that information or that insight to write a paper and publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, I'd get laughed at because it didn't meet a certain standard of how the data collection happened or the quality happened. Much further, if I went to try to go to the FDA or the EMA, the regulatory agencies, and tried to use that data to help support a drug approval or a therapy approval. Also, again, it's not quite to grade. So there's such thing as a research grade, some standardized measures. I can't just ask any question on Facebook and say, okay, cool, what's the answer? I've done that. It's developed insight, but that information is not useful for the FDA. So regulatory minded type data sets. One of the things that I'll talk about in a minute here that's really important, I think, to consider as we modernize is data sharing that is respectful of patient preferences. In the past, that was a really hard thing to do, and it had to be done by extension and by committee. And now with modern technology, we can bring that a lot closer to home so each individual can make their own choices. And then innovation, it's not the perfect way to measure it. One way to measure innovation in disease understanding is the number of available treatments, the number of people treated, how effective those treatments are. Those come further and further away as far as intervals. One of the more frequent intervals might be the number of publications that you generated. So if each publication represents something that you learned about the condition, that publication, a count of those publications coming out of that data set is one way to measure how much innovation that data set is contributing to the field. And then so for a bonus, this forward-thinking stuff, how do we, again, I nodded to it a second ago, how do we take advantage of modern technology and a vision for where we need to go as a field to unlock and make more and more study, more and more eyeballs that are trying to contribute to the health of all of us with the diseases and the health of the field. How do we make it really a lot easier so that when a drug makes it across the finish line, it happens both faster and based on how good that therapy is, or when guidelines and recommendations come out, those recommendations are based on really the strongest possible foundation that they can. We want to accelerate. This is that acceleration part of what we can do with data and how we can accelerate the health of our ecosystem. So this one's a kind of funny slide that Karmen probably correctly suggested we probably don't include, but I did anyway, because I think for me anyway, it's like a little bit of a historical perspective, a student of how these kinds of things happened. It's really valuable to put it in kind of a historical context of how we got here. So I think, initially you start the question of when you were diagnosed, and the AMDA was a really big part of this in the 90s for Pompe. Who else cares about this disease? And I figured out, hey, I care about it. And the leadership at the AMD, the parents involved at the AMDA said, hey, I'm going to connect with other researchers, other parents, all those kinds of things. And so it started out with a contact type of registry. Let's build community. Let's understand who's focused on this, who can participate in trials, who can participate in studies, et cetera. And we start to form community that way. Then we get into the question of, well, how does this disorder progress? And that might be a natural history study. And so these things, we probably started to hear about some of these things. If we're lucky enough to get to the point where we have a therapeutic or an intervention that has come across the line, one of the things that's pretty common to look at, especially for first line interventions, is, well, what happens to that over time? Clearly, we approved it. We don't have 5 years, 10 years down the line. We want to start collecting that. So what is the longitudinal intervention quality and durability look like? Eventually we start to say, like, oh, right, all of this information can be pretty useful. And so it was pretty common in the rare disease space to have pharmaceutical companies investing in collecting these data. One, they were already funding the most of it for the longitudinal study, and then just kind of expanded the thought process to get into building out a broader data set for research purposes. After that, we get to sort of the next layer of institutions. So these are the physicians or the researchers that are working at different places that say, hey, well, we can help too. we're the ones that actually see the patient. So we have a different layer of data that we can add to the thing. And also, in theory, we can work with multiple pharma companies. So if there was one pharma company that had a registry, another pharma company that was looking to get in the space might not have the same access to the data. Um, then it becomes pretty common to look at advocacy orgs looking into getting into the data use space. Guys, it's really valuable. Not only do we have the vested interest of the therapeutics, not only do we see the patients, but we actually are the patients or are the family members and represent that. So we have another layer of data and another layer of interest. And then this kind of brings us into what I think is that thing that I'm talking about, a modern view of it all. We're now at a point where we have tech that allows for individual preference, where your own individual choices can be honored, as opposed to having a representative, either data review board or advocacy org or institution or pharma representing what happens with the data or making decisions about what happens to the data. So you get to make the choices yourself directly. And we also recognize that having like all hands on deck is really what is best in our best interest. We want multiple pharma companies to be able to benefit from the richness of historical data so that they can develop better and better treatments. We want institutions to have access to the most amount of data so that they can do the most amount of research and contribute to the learning in the field that helps us learn how to manage the disease, understand the underlying mechanism to treat it, et cetera. And we want advocacy orgs also to play like just a huge role in all of that. And so that original concept of a contact registry, the natural history element, the longitudinal intervention element, all those are rolled up elements into each subsequent phase. But the concept of registries and data has just expanded over time. And now we recognize that this data is really, really valuable in terms of controlling the throttle for the speed that we're doing development on. This one's just a little quick, not meant to be everything to it, just to give an idea of what we mean by data and what the different kinds of sources are. There's lots of different data out there. Some of that contact stuff might be your name, your phone number, your email, all the way to your demographics, your age, sex, where you are in the world, those kinds of things. Patient-reported outcomes, Karmen will go into a little bit more of a proper definition and distinction of what a patient-reported outcome is, but most of us experience a piece of those, which are surveys that talk about what our disease experience is, what our feelings are, what our opinions are, et cetera. Then there's vitals, the stuff that you get every time you go to the doctor. Claims, so there's claims data sets out there that pharmaceutical companies and other researchers can use to say, how often are certain medicines prescribed, to whom are they prescribed, where are they prescribed throughout the country, around the world, et cetera. I won't read all of them, but you get the point. There's a bunch of stuff, some of the performance assessments, the labs we're mostly familiar with, some of the imaging we're familiar with, et cetera. And so some of those sources we'll do a better job of looking at here. So we have all of these different streams of data. And again, this is a very, very generalized idea about like where we can get those data to pool them together to help somebody with a research question, cross-reference different elements of data with what their research question is, and to develop an answer or a plan for the research. So some of those on the left side, we have some of those sort of broad data categories, and along the top there, we have some different sources of them. So some of that stuff historically, the basic things are self-reported. I say, hey, my name is this, my geography is this, I feel this way. A lot of it's really been centered historically around the clinic. So we have expert physicians who, see not just me with the disease, but also 5 other people, and have lots of years of medical school and training and research, so they also collect some of this stuff, and some of that stuff we also aggregate already in we're already jumping ahead, aggregates into the EMR. And then we have laboratory data that comes from different labs and some specialty labs for genetic stuff, et cetera. And then with these aggregators, so this is like Epic or MyChart in the US that you may have seen, or claims databases that aggregate different amounts of those data that can be useful. And in a historical sense, a lot of those things have really relied specifically on the clinic to do the data collection, because it's been thought that's the only way to get quality into the data. And as we get more and more modern in our tech-enabled solutions and more integrated with electronic medical records and electronic record keeping in these medical environments, you might have already seen, for example, LabCorp or Quest, if you were doing blood tests, that you can download an app from each of them and look at your tests over time. You can also do that same thing in MyChart, and you then should also be able to do all of this in the same place and have it aggregate so that you're not having to do it, but we're also not having to burden the physician or slow down already busy physicians to add all of this data and collect it in the right place. And so this is kind of like that modern vision of how we can kind of accumulate all this data for max utility, max research, max speed. I'm almost done, I swear, and then we'll turn it over to the good part of this with Karmen. But just want to give an example here of how important language is and how important purpose is in the actual studies. So we'll give an example of how purpose affects design. So with a natural history study, both NIH, the National Institutes of Health, people that study diseases, and the FDA, folks who approve diseases, approve treatments in the US, have two different views of what a natural history study's purpose is. And that changes a little bit how you structure the study and do all the things that we talked about on that one of those first slides about how you shape or imagine what a registry might look like. So for NIH, the primary focus of a natural history study is developing scientific understanding, feeding into the preclinical work that prepares for eventual trials. Whereas the FDA looks at it as something that supports regulatory development or supports the drug development and regulatory approval. So did the intervention change the natural history from what was expected? On data use, so NIH might focus on biomarker discovery, genotype, phenotype links, whereas FDA is only focused on maybe a smaller set of endpoints that prove that the drug or the intervention did something different. Design rigor, there's different levels of rigor that go into it. So you have a little bit more flexibility in an exploratory understanding of scientific land at the NIH, whereas FDA focus, even before you start a trial into the first human, you have to have a plan approved and bought in for how you're going to do everything with them. And then a couple of other things. So one of the things here just to introduce is the concept of stakeholders, and we mentioned it a little bit before. So for the NIH, there's researchers, there's patient groups, there's consortia across the board that are involved in creating those kinds of studies. And sometimes on the FDA side, it's really you're looking at sponsors, so drug developers, regulators, and also there's some pre-work there with eventually payers. So in the US, that would be like your insurance company. In other countries, the payer and the regulator might be aligned. So who you're looking to satisfy, what information you're looking to collect is a little bit different. And again, in a modern, fast-moving world, one of the things that we hear a lot about in the pace of drug development that slows it down is that there's these differing perspectives when, from our side, when we're advocacy orgs and fighting for it, and again, I didn't realize I was going to try to flatter the AMDA so much here, but they're well deserving of it. One of the earliest things that the AMDA did and published a paper a number of years ago on the model is try to bring together researchers, patient groups, sponsors, regulators, bring together all these different perspectives into a single room, into a single discussion to try to help things go faster. And I think, our history since then has been forever improved because of that. And now we're looking at, okay, how do we take that inspiration and build on it for the next phase of what our development looks like? So last one before I hand it over to Karmen. Some quick examples of Pompe registries, just so that I leave you with something that actually looks familiar after talking way too much and getting way too nerdy there for a minute. I think a lot of us on this call will be familiar with institution-led research studies. So those are the ones like, if you've heard of the Duke Registry or if you're in Europe or working with the IPA much, there's Erasmus Medical Center that's generated some stuff. And like some really cool things that come out of it are some publications. And then like the Pompe variant database has come out of the Erasmus Medical Center as an example. And then there's a lot of country specific ones that are associated. So there's at Worlds that we were just at, there were some papers published by the French group and the Spanish group on their national registry sets. Then there's academic advocacy partnered PRO studies. So the International Pompe Association and Erasmus have the Pompe survey that hopefully everybody's participating in. If not, definitely hit up somebody about some information at that. Maybe we can throw it in the link when this video is posted. Sorry, Matt, for the extra work there. Then there's some biopharma-led registries. So I think the largest one in our space is the Pompe registry, which is the Sanofi Pompe registry. And this is the one that Sanofi first to the market with the therapeutic started out as that longitudinal study and then has evolved since then. That one's about 20 years old now. And then more recently is the Amicus Pompe registry that they've kicked off in the last year and a half or so. And then what Karmen's going to talk about is what we think is this kind of a version of a modern concept of a patient-led registry called Progress for Pompe. And so if I can leave with a couple of thoughts, things that are good, things that we want is first and foremost, honoring each individual so that you have individual discretion on what happens with your data, how to participate with it, who gets access to it, etc. After that, we want to make sure that we have it accessible to as broad a research community as possible. At least for my stake in it all, I want any academic, any industry, whether they're a professional academic or somebody's older sister, brother, cousin, uncle that knows how to whip around some data, that has a pure interest. I want multiple pharmaceutical companies. I want everybody to be able to study this disease so that we can get better treatments, better understanding of the diseases as fast as possible. But we need the quality to be high enough to support the publications and regulatory needs that translate research into tangible progress. Yeah, with that, I will head it off to Karmen. And I guess just let me know when you want to click through slides.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. So I think if I were listening to that and thinking about all of those different studies that exist, I would be thinking maybe like, why do we need another study if there are all these research studies and registries that already exist? Why did the Pompe community and the RareX team come together to start another one? And so, Ryan, you can go to the next slide. And so when Ryan and some others in the Pompe community kind of approached the RareX team, you know, some of the goals of having really a patient-led, patient-owned registry is to improve the understanding of Pompe disease, including those very early signs and symptoms, which really means engaging families who have been, whose children have been identified through newborn screening. So how do we learn from these very young kids, some of whom end up on therapy, some don't in those very, very early years? How do we follow them and get data there? Also, how can we develop a central repository of longitudinal data, so of long-term data, to correlate outcomes with treatments? So the FDA in the United States, the AMA in Europe, other regulatory agencies around the world tend to have very, very good mechanisms for clinical trials to understand, is this particular therapy working, right? Does it work better than maybe what already exists? So sometimes you'll see a clinical trial design where there is a more sort of new emerging type of therapy, like a gene therapy, but there are other types of kind of more modern emerging therapies as well. How does that compare with existing enzyme replacement therapies? Those mechanisms are in place, but what's not typically in place is like, okay, well, once you have a couple of different modalities, meaning types of treatments that are available, how do we follow people long term and see what are the differences in long term outcomes between them on different therapies? And there's not a lot of great mechanisms for that other than these kinds of studies where somebody takes on following lots of individuals on and off therapy on different therapies for a long time. The community also told us they want to really support better diagnosis. So many, if not all of you, are well aware that we know from population-based data, much of which comes from newborn screening now, that the true incidence of Pompe disease is many times higher than the number of people who are recognized and diagnosed. So how do we change that? How do we improve the diagnosis? Well, we're only going to improve the diagnosis if we start to recognize what are some of the early signs that we're not recognizing today. So if we get more and more people to enter their experience, their data into a central repository, if we get more people to share it that way, along with like the history of what their symptoms look like before they got diagnosed, that should help us. And then as Ryan said, like, how can we make this data available to as many researchers, as many therapy developers, as many innovators as possible? And how do we increase participation from underrepresented populations? So, one of the big things that I want to make sure that everybody hears from the two of us is that we don't think this replaces academic medical center studies. Those are really, really critical. They've taught us so much and they're going to continue to teach us so much. But we also know that there are many, many people who don't have the resources to travel to one of those really big centers. Many people who don't participate in clinical trials, but we want them to participate too, and we want we want their data, we want their experiences captured. You can go to the next slide, Ryan. And so with that, like with all of those kind of ideas and goals in mind, when we were approached at RareX, I think here's why that seemed like RareX seemed to be a really good fit. So RareX got started. RareX is now a program of Global Genes. Some of you may know that RareX started independently, and then we merged with Global Genes a little over 3 years ago. So RareX is the research arm, really, of Global Genes. It is a registry platform that was really started in response to some pretty big problems in rare diseases broadly. And so some of those problems are that in really rare diseases, data often does exist, maybe in a couple of studies, but it tends to be disparate, like spread out and not connected. And it's difficult to get that data out often. So you might be able to get insights out of the data, which is great, but being able to get like patient level data to compare one data set to another is very, very difficult. Also, many rare disease organizations will start their own registry, but they tend to do it with like 1 or 2 surveys that different clinicians or researchers in their network will tell them this is something we need. But those surveys are often kind of a pet project of one researcher or another, which doesn't make them bad. It just means they're usually only ever used by that one researcher. So maybe something really great came of it, but it was one study. And so there is this need to make sure that the data is collected in such a way that it can be used by many different researchers across many different studies because you can compare the data. So I'll show you how we do that. And then the other thing is that the other big reason for why RareX was started is that we want data to be owned by patients ultimately. We want patients and families to be able to say, this is our data. We want it shared. Here's how we want it shared. And so with that, we got started on this collaboration together. Oh, I just tried to advance. Ryan, can you go to the next slide? And so with that, we launched this project together. So I think a little bit of this is duplicative, so I'll be quick on this slide. So a patient-led study or a patient-led data project really means that patients not only ultimately can own their data, but they control how it can be used. What that means for us is that we're not going to go back and ask people over and over again, can we share it with this researcher? Can we share it with this researcher? Instead, we ask broad categories. Many people tell us, like, look, I just want this data to be used by anyone who is doing research on Pompe. I understand you guys are keeping the data really safe and I trust that. So please just share it with anyone who's doing research who you guys recognize as a qualified researcher. But other people will tell us, you know what, like I really only want this used for certain types of research. Like, for example, some people really don't want it used for health economics outcomes research. They're like, no, I only want it used for really like understanding the disease, the progression of the disease, the development of therapeutics. So there are a couple of like categories that we ask, and we are very, very careful to adhere to those preferences. This, I'm gonna skip a couple of things because we talked about it on the last one. This is a global registry, so we do adhere to requirements, including GDPR standards from multiple different countries and jurisdictions around the world to make sure that we can do that. It is free to patients and families to come on and participate, and we handle all the governance. So we handle things like, the IRB submissions and working with the Institutional Review Board and making sure that we're managing all of those global standards. Next, Ryan. Okay, so this is one of the primary ways that we make sure that data is really standardized and robust to enable that data to be used across many different, by many different types of researchers and in kind of concert with other types of studies, is we implement patient-reported clinical outcome assessment measures. That's a mouthful. And I feel like PROs get thrown around a lot, COAs get thrown around a lot, and many people are confused about what really is a PRO and how are they used. So I'm just going to walk through it on a slide. So a clinical outcome assessment, or a COA, is a standardized tool for capturing meaningful information about the patient experience. Okay, so that can be how a patient is feeling, how they're functioning. It typically is kind of narrow, like how you might be functioning from a motor perspective, how you might be functioning from a respiratory and swallowing perspective. But a clinical outcome assessment measure is like broadly any kind of tool or measure that captures that patient experience. A PRO, you can read what I wrote here and I'm about to say it, but first I'm going to say some people will define a PRO as anything a patient tells you, right? That's a patient-reported outcome. I would argue that anything a patient tells you is probably not an outcome, but if you were to ask a patient, like Ryan said, he used to do something very informally and just ask his friends, like, how are you feeling? That's a patient-reported outcome. It's not a clinical outcome assessment, right? It is not a standardized measure. So when we talk about PROs and we talk about using them in studies, and not just this study on RareX, the Progress for Pompe study, but any of the studies we just described. When we talk about PROs, we are talking about a subtype of a clinical outcome assessment measure. And so that means that to many of you, this looks like an annoying survey, but it is it has been very, very intentionally designed. It has been designed and tested and validated in such a way that we as a larger research community can trust that this captures the patient experience. It has been tested in this patient community, and we know that it is a good way to measure symptoms, to measure disease impact, to measure feelings about disease across the community in a way that really provides a broad spectrum of experiences and provides like room for people to get worse or better as a study is ongoing over time. So in this context, a patient-reported measure is really this very standardized, very robust research tool where we're asking the patient directly to be the reporter. So the FDA recognizes 4 types of meaningful COAs. One is a clinician observation. So that is literally like a clinician is either interviewing the patient or family or observing something about function in the clinic. A performance outcome, so that would be something like a 6-minute walk test, right? This would be something where there is a physical measurement that is captured. It can be what we just described, or what I just described, a patient-reported outcome, or a caregiver-reported outcome. So sometimes patient-reported and caregiver-reported get kind of clumped together because if you have a very young child, the caregiver is really the person who is in the position to be able to report that. Now, technically, there is a fifth category, and that is a proxy. The FDA strongly advises against using true proxies, which means that, like, if I were the proxy for somebody, I would answer as if I were them. I would try to imagine what it would be like to live in their shoes and to answer like them. I think for obvious reasons, we don't usually want to do that, especially when we're trying to understand what is the impact of this to someone's, say, fatigue, right? I don't want to try to answer for my daughter, like how fatigued she's feeling. Okay, so how are these used? So these are really important in studies. You see them across lots of studies. They're used to quantify outcomes that matter to patients. So the FDA is actually has been very vocal, I would say over the last 5+ years, about the importance of patient experience data and capturing patient experience data through PROs, because those really quantify those outcomes that matter most to patients. They can also be used to correlate biomarkers or other potential endpoints in clinical trials with the patient experience. So I've heard people at the FDA talk about how, well, in other diseases, like, well, you, sponsor, brought forward this interesting biomarker, and we'd like to consider it, but you haven't proven to us that when you see a change in this protein, this enzyme, right, whatever, it correlates with something that actually matters to the patient. So we want to see that data side by side. And then sometimes PROs can be directly used as endpoints in clinical trials. So in the study that we're doing, Progress for Pompe, we are definitely utilizing these. Okay, Ryan. Okay, this is really busy, and we'll make it available later. But this is just to tell you that we did not, like, randomly as a team just decide, like, okay, well, we know that PROs are important, and we know that it's important to capture things like symptoms leading up to diagnosis and genetic testing results, and, like, we're just going to decide what goes on this platform. We actually pulled together an expert working group that consisted of 17 different individuals. Those included individuals who are diagnosed with Pompe disease, some caregivers of children with Pompe, physicians, researchers, people who are working at biopharma companies who are developing therapies and really thinking a lot about clinical trial design. So we pulled together this working group, and we worked through, first, let's look at the green-yellow chart. First, what are the symptoms and impacts of Pompe disease? And when we look at those, what are the most critical ones to measure when we're thinking about the natural course of the disease and therapies? And then we broke that down and said, okay, for which ones of these are patient-reported outcomes most suitable? Because we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're not trying to do all the things there ever are to do in Pompe disease. We're trying to really capture patient experience with Progress for Pompe and then correlate that with other types of data. And so the ones at the top are the ones that were really determined by this working group to be most suitable, and what we're really making sure to focus on when we're getting some of those patient-reported outcome measures. I will say we do also have some patient-reported outcome measures that do measure things like respiratory function, but we know that, like, that's not going to be the primary way it's measured in a clinical trial. It's like a supporting way. Is a patient saying, do they feel like they're breathing better? Are they able to do things they weren't before because their breathing is better, for example? Okay, Ryan, you can go next. And so I want to tie this up because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. But essentially, when someone decides that they want to join this study, it is an online study. It's very easy to join. They register, they do their consent, and they tell us how they want their data shared. They do what we call a head-to-toe survey of symptoms. And then only based on what they say yes to. So only what's applicable to them. Do they get symptom-based surveys? Those very distinct patient-reported outcome measures. And then there are some Pompe specific measures that have already been used in clinical trials and other research studies that we are utilizing so that that data across studies is really set up for success for comparing data. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for anyone who is interested in joining, literally, if you just capture this, and we'll send it out later too, but literally, if you capture this, like the first step is like a 90-second thing, like, yes, I'm interested, and just enter it. And then you can go and you can actually get started later. The initial like registration, getting set up, all of that does take about half hour or so. So probably you're not going to do that right at this moment, but you can capture that. And then we also want, next slide, Ryan. We also want to make sure to like invite anyone to really be active in what we're doing more broadly. So Progress for Pompe is the registry focus of what we're working on right now. But the Pompe Consortium and the larger Pompe community are working on a number of initiatives, and some of those are around, building some centralized resourcing and really making sure that we're kind of meeting the needs of the patient community when we're thinking about what educational resources are desired. How can we better facilitate communication between all of the participating patient advocacy organizations? So there are lots of little like work streams happening. And I think that's it. I will turn it back to you, Ryan, and maybe back to you, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Carmen. If you guys have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the window. We don't have any questions just yet. I have one. How many patients have you registered so far with this initiative?
How many patients have we registered so far? Maybe 60 or something like that. Yeah.
I think one of the things to point out there is that there's research value in folks that don't have a diagnosis as well. So, for example, family members and or siblings, we often say, okay, cool. I feel like my child or my brother or sister is going through, or my parent is going through all this alone. Like, I wish there was something more I could do. For example, if you have two kids that are raised in the same house with the same diet, the same seasons, the same everything else, both of them can participate in this research study. And for certain research questions, there's stuff that we'll look to say, what is the sort of the age environmental controlled comparison between these two kids, or between group A and group B. So I think that number that Carmen gave is the signups since the study launched end of last year that have Pompe, but just to clarify for everybody, it's open to parents, to siblings as well, for additional research questions.
Awesome. We have a question from Jared. Do the patient participants have access to the data, or do you have to be identified as a qualified researcher?
In general, like individual participants, so somebody who, is affected with Pompe, or like Ryan said, it could be, a sibling or somebody, will not get the de-identified data. So maybe I should back up and talk about like, what is a qualified researcher, right? Like, this is a question that people often have, like, what does that mean to be a qualified researcher? Honestly, you have to be somebody who has like a genuine research interest. You can't be like, I want to poke around in your data and see what's there. You have to have a genuine research question. And you have to meet the data privacy standards if you are going to get de-identified but patient level data, right? So patient level data where you're like, okay, this is like patient one in the registry, and here are all the things that they've answered, right? All the way out. That's really sensitive data. So we have to balance. Like, we want to share data widely enough that we're really encouraging innovation, but we have to be really careful about that data, especially in any rare disease. So, so we do generate generally like quarterly reports with like broad insights, and those are not patient level data. It's like broad insights that we're learning, and generally those will be shared by the community. So that's something that I think that the Pompe community is really well set up to do. And like I was just very briefly mentioning, like we're working together on building some resources on a kind of centralized website so we can put some of that stuff out there. So that's the intent, is people will be able to come there. I think it would be great if we could also, as we start to put some of that data out there, get questions from people saying like, well, I'd also like to see this. Like, could you provide some insights around this? Like, I think ongoing engagement is the goal. It's not like we do what we think is right and just report it out.
Yeah, and to become there is a process that is part of the approach here, is that there's a process to become a
Mhm.
qualified researcher, that anybody can be. You don't have to be employed by a pharmaceutical company or an academic institution looking at Pompe. You just need to meet the basic requirements for stewardship that RareX has set forth in their governance documents. And then from there, everything falls under whatever the individual's preference is. You're muted, Matt.
Thank you.
No,
We have
I got you. It's your turn this time.
appreciate it, Ryan. Thank you so much. We have a question from Paul. He said, "Understand, outstanding presentation, Ryan and Carmen. On the last slide, you have a number of advocacy groups listed along with a couple of biopharma companies. And he says he was surprised to see Sanofi in there, giving that you mentioned they have their own registry and the largest in the world, if he understands correctly. Can you elaborate why they're doing both? And if biopharma companies are not listed as supporters, do they have access to the data?"
So, I mean, maybe I'll answer the part. We can't obviously speak towards whatever their intentions are. When we went through this initial launch, we opened it up to anybody who had an interest in the Pompe space, and both Astellas and Sanofi have chosen to participate. My understanding of the conversation is that while there is perhaps some competitive advantage or thoughts towards that from having their own data set, they also have recognized and had strong leadership towards the value of overall community health, and have sort of put their wallets where their mouth is, I guess. Is that the awkward way to say that? They chose to participate. Folks that you do not see represented are still included. Obviously from a consortium side, we had a meeting at Worlds in San Diego this past 2 weeks ago, where everybody was invited, whether or not they've previously participated in the consortium stuff. We're open and welcome to any org that wants to be, org or individual or company that wants to participate in shaping the future direction of that consortium that's like trying to build out the infrastructure for our space. We're open to participation, and we actively welcome it. I think, generally we've kind of said, all right, folks, there are infrastructure costs for building out some of this. And we would expect that folks that have that stand to have a commercial benefit from that would participate in supporting that infrastructure cost. And the way that we've kind of tried to keep good intentions honest is, if you are an industry researcher, there are certain Pompe specific questions that fall under an embargo for a period of time. They eventually become available, and just because you are an industry who's chosen to support the infrastructure costs does not mean you have access to any data that individuals I don't want to share with them. But for the data that meets first that threshold of somebody says, hey, I want to share this broadly, I'm open to sharing it with them. Then secondly, if you have a commercial interest, you've participated in helping the infrastructure costs, then you have access to the embargoed subset of the data.
Yeah, if I may, I think I would just add one thing to the why, right? Which is, if we are able, and it takes individuals with Pompe, families who are managing kids with Pompe, all of whom are busy and have a lot going on, right? It takes people going on and doing this on their own and making that commitment of time. And we recognize and honor that effort. So it does take that. But if we get people to actually do it and to come in and to register, we have the potential here, especially with these more newly diagnosed families who I've heard from many of them really want there to be better data. Like there's just not a ton of data yet, like following these kids long term. We have the potential to grow something really big here together. And if we do that, it is really in the interest of every single therapy developer to want that to happen, to want a larger data set, to want to understand the natural history of it, to want to understand like what is the most reasonable and appropriate time for intervention, right? All of these kinds of questions, like everybody should want that data and want to support the growth of this kind of a resource.
Yeah, a Sanofi data set, an Amicus data set, a company X, Y, and Z, as we have continued its success with more companies coming into the space, like fractioning our rare disease into smaller and smaller sets does not serve the purposes of development speed. And I think everybody recognizes that and wants to do something different. It's just a matter of, kind of making the leap to pool together and make sure we're doing it in a responsible and correct way.
Awesome. Thank you. Jared also wanted to say, very good presentation, and thank you very much. He asks, are clinicians inputting data on their patients, or is this strictly for patients to enter their data?
At this point, this is for patients and caregivers only to be entering data. I will tell you, as somebody who has worked in rare disease diagnosis, management, research for 25 years, that asking clinicians to do something extra when there's not a research study that they're on staff for means it's not going to happen. Like it's not going to happen. These clinicians are incredibly busy and overworked. So like we actually could enable it today. Like we have a clinician portal. We could enable it. It doesn't work. So what we have to do is we have to find ways to like marry data sets to build something more central where we can pull together what's already been done and doesn't require people to do more work with what the patient got started, with what only they can provide, which is the experience data from their voice.
And I'll add to it just to add pressure to it with the vision. I talked a lot about kind of vision forward-looking stuff, modern tech solutions, etc. Integrating stuff that would historically require clinicians to be entered, we see as the more scalable path, the more sustainable path for some of the reasons that Karmen mentioned, and then also from having to compensate and get to physicians who may not be experienced with it. So like we can start to upload data sets from EMRs, again, with the right permissions and sharing preferences and consent and all those kinds of things, or connect with wearables on all those kinds of things. So that's all stuff that's in sort of future scope of and development space for this kind of data set. There's a little bit of we've got to build it incrementally over time. There are some costs and things going on with that, but those are some of the discussions that the consortium is helping to shape what the future prioritization looks like.
I have a question. So if they do the initial registration in the survey, how often do you suggest that they update their data?
Most of the surveys get sent out once a year. Some of them will just ask if there's been any change, right? So like we have a diagnosis survey that asks about like how you were diagnosed. And like if you had genetic testing, if you did, do you know the gene? By the way, if you didn't notice it on a previous slide, we do actually have people, if they have it, upload their genetic test reports, and we have an expert genetics team that curates that data into discrete data elements for the researchers so that people don't have to do that on their own. They can just upload a report and we do it. But that diagnosis survey, oh, and then the diagnosis survey also asks if they have any family members who are affected. So like that one, when it gets sent out once a year, just says, have you had any changes to your diagnosis? have you had genetic testing, or are there any additional family members who've been diagnosed? And if you say no, like you're done. And if you say yes, you update it. The clinical, the PROs that I described, like most of those we want annually and they get sent out annually. Ryan looks like he's dying to say something to this question.
I was just expecting such a different answer from you.
You were?
So one of the things that happens in the background here that Karmen put a lot of awesome work into is the logic into who gets what surveys and based on what answers you have in the head to toe. And so she mentioned in there in passing that if you say I have respiratory issues, you're going to get a respiratory survey, or maybe that's a terrible example. But if you say I have fatigue, I'm going to get fatigue. If you say that fatigue isn't a symptom for me, then you're not going to get a fatigue one, and that's all some of the logic. And so the frequency at which we get those, and the platform, there is the ability to set reminders to do them at whatever interval you need to do. So it's one of the one of the opportunities of the working group around this to say, all right, cool, for this one, like genetics, we don't need to do that or ask everybody, has their genetics changed in the last year? No, like that's a waste of people's time. Let's not do that. So that logic is there. But if we say, oh, hey, for somebody wants to, this particular feature about maybe mental health as a future survey, getting a year interval isn't enough. We want to do more. We can set the interval higher based on guidance from the expert working groups. And again, I use the word expert there to include the cross perspective, cross functional roles within the ecosystem.
Oh, I'm reading. There's a note from Matt Alsante. I ran a registry that only required copying and mailing or faxing. You're dating yourself, Matt. Of the medical records once consented, and then registry staff would enter the detailed information. This removes the IT needs or a text solution from the hospital. It worked reasonably well, though sort of old school. You
I'll
know,
defend that. The medical system still uses fax for stuff. It's like very shocking.
I know, I know.
So
It is not
I got your
1985,
back.
but
I got your
but
back.
I think we are working really hard to come up with solutions that are lower effort for the data contributors. And the data contributors can mean study staff. That very much means the participant, whether that's a patient or a caregiver. So I hear you. Some of those old school methods do work.
Yeah.
It's so much effort. We're working really hard to get to a lower effort that we can really scale.
Yeah, exactly. Scalability is everything. So like doing a manual input or having an intervention for 30, 60 people, maybe 100 is also kind of fine. You can do that at a reasonable cost and headcount.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about cross platforms, cross diseases, trying to service thousands of participants,
Yeah.
that just becomes a really, really an increasing line item in the budget that you have to come up with every year to keep on doing it. So I think there will always be space, and certainly, again, not to keep plugging the working groups and saying, hey, if you have ideas or are passionate about this kind of stuff, come participate in it. Don't just throw darts from the outside, Matt Alsante. But come on in. Like we want to find a way that works across the full breadth of people. So for people that are tech enabled, then like cool, let's make it really easy. For people that don't prefer that mechanism, we still want to have them have an opportunity to participate and remove any of the socioeconomic tech access to tech, all the kind of different burdens that might exist that can bias data sets. We want to make sure to remove all those, but like Karmen said, strive towards things that scale across the board and support everybody.
Yeah. Because our goal is to make it even like considerably less effort than it is now. Like we are very actively looking for ways to reduce the amount of time it takes to get registered, reduce the amount of time that it takes for people to, fill out some of the important work. Like what's removable to make it simpler? How can we get it like on a really good mobile interaction that's more interactive that people can do in little bits and spurts, which most of us honestly just work this way now. Like you get little bits of time here and there. That's what's going to make it scalable. You have to make it like easier. You have to make it top of mind a little bit more often without it being like, oh, once a year I sit down and spend a lot of time on this.
Yeah, and one thing to clarify on the scalability part of it, I mean, there's 350,000 people in the world that have Pompe that are not diagnosed right now. So that's one dimension of scale, but the other one that is really probably we're going to realize a lot sooner is, the rare X platform has multiple conditions, and so there's some stuff that we want to only look at a Pompe specific cohort, but then maybe there's motion related disorders or respiratory related disorders, things that affect those domains that we can look at across cross diseases to answer certain kinds of research questions or make development on. And so when we're talking about scaling, it's not just people with Pompe or family members, et cetera. It's also where there's opportunity to push domain specific development forward across diseases. And that's one of the cool things about going to like a generalized platform that has the ability to tailor specifically to this disease, but also has coverage for a broader set of questions that might fit a family of disorders.
Excellent. This has been a great talk. I really appreciate you guys coming on and doing this. And it's pretty exciting, I would say. Yeah, with what we can do with tech and we're no longer having to fax things in. You can set up automated surveys to go out depending on people's their choices and their data that they submit. So that's some really exciting thing. We are at time, so this will conclude the evening's webinar. Thank you again, Ryan and Carmen, for that great talk. And thank you everyone for participating. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, AMDA.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good night.